The sun hung low in the sky as Jake Miller adjusted the straps of his backpack and took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. The vast wilderness stretched before him, untouched, serene, and eerily silent. This was exactly why he had come. A solo trek through the rugged backcountry was supposed to be an escape from the noise of everyday life, a chance to clear his mind. Jake was no amateur. He had spent years hiking some of the most challenging trails in the country. He knew how to navigate rough terrain, how to read the weather, and how to survive alone. But despite all his experience, he had never truly faced danger. Not the kind that made your heart pound and your instincts scream. As he moved deeper into the mountains, the wind picked up, howling through the narrow valleys like a distant warning. The trees swayed, their skeletal branches casting long, twisted shadows over the rocky path. Something about the silence unsettled him. No birds. No rustling leaves. Just the sound of his own footsteps crunching against the frost-covered ground. Jake pulled his jacket tighter around him. It was getting colder, faster than it should. A storm was likely rolling in. He needed to find a good spot to set up camp before nightfall. Just as he reached for his map, a faint sound echoed through the canyon, a cry, distant and weak. He froze. It wasn't the wind. It was not an animal. It was something else. And they needed help. Jake wiped a thin layer of sweat from his forehead, despite the biting cold. The hike had been more challenging than expected, and his legs ached from the relentless incline. He reached a rocky outcrop and dropped his backpack, stretching his arms as he took in the breathtaking yet unforgiving landscape. Jagged peaks loomed overhead, their snow-dusted summits piercing the sky. The valley below stretched endlessly, a maze of towering cliffs and hidden ravines. As he reached for his water bottle, something stopped him cold. A sound. Faint, almost swallowed by the wind. At first, he thought he was imagining it, a soft, high-pitched whimper, barely audible over the rustling of distant trees. His muscles tensed. A wounded animal? A lost hiker? He stood perfectly still, listening. The sound came again, this time clearer. Jake's heart pounded as he grabbed his flashlight and scanned the landscape. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows over the valley. He followed the sound, his boots crunching against the frost-covered ground, until he reached the edge of a deep ravine. He peered over cautiously, his breath catching in his throat. Two tiny figures huddled together at the bottom of the rocky pit. Jake's stomach twisted. They were barely moving, their small bodies trembling against the cold stone. Their fur, once likely soft and fluffy, was now matted with dirt, their ribs faintly visible beneath their skin. They were starving. Freezing. Terrified. He clenched his jaw. How the hell did they get down there? There was no sign of a mother, no tracks leading in or out. Had someone abandoned them? Had they fallen in by accident? It didn't matter. They wouldn't last much longer. Jake's breath came out in a cloud of mist as he surveyed the ravine. The walls were steep, slick with ice in some places, jagged in others. Climbing down would be risky, but leaving them wasn't an option. He exhaled sharply, already making up his mind. He had to get them out. Jake's mind raced as he assessed the situation. The ravine was deep, at least 30 feet down, maybe more. The rocky walls were uneven, lined with sharp outcroppings that could either serve as footholds or become deadly obstacles. One wrong move, one slip, and he'd be in just as much trouble as the puppies. He swallowed hard, glancing at the tiny creatures below. They were huddled together, their bodies pressed tightly against each other for warmth. One of them, a small, golden-furred pup, lifted its head weakly and let out another soft whimper. The other, darker in color, barely moved. Jake clenched his jaw. They didn't have time to wait for help. He instinctively reached for his phone, but as expected, there was no signal. Out here, miles away from civilization, he was completely on his own. If he left to find a way back to safety, he had no doubt the puppies would be dead before he returned. His eyes flicked to the cliffside again. Could he make it down? His body ached from the hike, and exhaustion tugged at his limbs, but he had no choice. If he didn't act now, it would be too late. "All right," he muttered under his breath, adjusting his backpack. "Let's do this." Jake quickly rummaged through his gear, pulling out a length of paracord, strong, but not designed for full body support. It was meant for securing tents, fixing broken straps, even makeshift repairs, not rappelling down a sheer rock face. But it was all he had. He scanned the area for something sturdy, a tree, a boulder, anything that could anchor the rope. A thick, gnarled tree stood a few feet away, its roots gripping the earth like claws. He looped the paracord around the base, yanked hard to test its strength, then secured it with a tight mountaineer hitch. "Good enough," he muttered, though doubt gnawed at the back of his mind. With one last deep breath, he gripped the rope and swung his legs over the edge. The moment his weight shifted off solid ground, gravity yanked at him. His hands burned as the cord bit into his palms, and his boots scraped against the icy rock. The cold air rushed past his face as he carefully lowered himself down, inch by inch. Halfway down, the first rock gave way. A chunk of ice-caked stone broke loose beneath his foot, sending him lurching sideways. His grip slipped. The rope slid through his fingers, tearing at his skin as he fought to regain control. His heart pounded against his ribs. For a split second, he was in freefall. Then, jerk. The rope caught just in time, wrenching his shoulder as he slammed against the rock wall. Pain shot through his arm, but he gritted his teeth, forcing himself to breathe. Below, the puppies stirred at the sudden noise, their frightened eyes locking onto him. They were waiting. Trusting him. He couldn't let them down. Jake tightened his grip and continued his descent, every muscle in his body burning with strain. The ground was getting closer. Just a few more feet, then, with a final controlled drop, his boots hit solid earth. He exhaled sharply, his breath clouding in the freezing air. He made it. But now came the hard part, getting back up. And he wasn't alone anymore. Jake took a moment to steady his breathing, his knuckles white from gripping the paracord. The cold bit at his exposed fingers, but he ignored it. He was committed now, there was no turning back. The puppies below whimpered again, their tiny bodies pressed against each other for warmth. They were counting on him. Slowly, he continued his descent, carefully placing his feet against the jagged rock face. The paracord creaked under his weight, a constant reminder that it wasn't built for this kind of strain. He had to move fast, but carefully. Halfway down, his boot slipped on an ice-coated section of rock. His stomach lurched as his body jolted, but he tightened his grip, pushing his feet against the cliffside to regain control. That's when he heard it. A sickening, almost imperceptible sound, like fabric tearing. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He glanced up just in time to see it, the rope was fraying against a jagged rock edge above him. No. 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 Panic surged through him. He tried to adjust his weight, easing the tension on the weakened section of the cord, but it was too late. Snap. The rope snapped in half. For a split second, time slowed. The feeling of weightlessness overtook him as the ground rushed up to meet him. A sheer, gut-wrenching drop. Then, impact. His body slammed into the rocky floor of the ravine, pain exploding through his side as he rolled over the uneven terrain. His head spun. His vision blurred. His leg twisted beneath him at an unnatural angle before the momentum finally stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sharp sting of cold against his face and the overwhelming throbbing in his leg. Then, a whimper. Jake forced his eyes open. The puppies were only a few feet away, staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. They didn't understand what had just happened. Jake let out a shaky breath and tried to sit up. Agony shot through his leg. He gasped, clutching his knee. Something was wrong. His body screamed in protest as he shifted, but he had to assess the damage. Carefully, he reached down and pressed against his shin. A lightning bolt of pain shot up his body, forcing a strangled cry from his throat. Not broken, but badly injured. He clenched his jaw. This was bad. Before, it had been just the puppies who needed saving. Now, they weren't the only ones trapped. Jake exhaled shakily, forcing himself to focus. He wasn't dead. That was the important part. But getting out of here just became a hell of a lot harder. The puppies whimpered again, their tiny bodies shivering in the cold. Despite the pain, Jake reached out a trembling hand, gently brushing against the golden-furred one. It let out a soft, uncertain sound but didn't pull away. The darker puppy scooted a little closer. Even in their fear, they were seeking warmth. Seeking comfort. Jake swallowed hard, his breath coming out in shaky clouds. "Don't worry, little guys," he murmured, voice hoarse. "We're getting out of here." Even if he had no idea how. A sharp gust of wind howled through the ravine, cutting through Jake's jacket like a blade. He gritted his teeth and curled his fingers, trying to bring feeling back into them. The temperature was dropping fast. Above him, the sky had deepened into a dull gray, the sun sinking behind the jagged peaks. The last light of day was fading, and with it, any warmth. Night in the mountains was unforgiving. The wind was not just cold, it was the kind that stole warmth straight from your bones, that made your breath come out in sharp, misty bursts before disappearing into the abyss. Jake shivered violently. He'd taken falls before, suffered injuries on the trail, but never had he been this vulnerable. His leg throbbed, a deep, pulsing ache that told him the damage was worse than he wanted to admit. He clenched his jaw, trying to push past the pain, but his body was already responding to the cold. His limbs felt sluggish. His head light. Hypothermia was creeping in. Then, a small sound. A soft, trembling whimper. Jake looked down at the two puppies still huddled together, their tiny bodies shivering against the frozen ground. They were barely moving now. They weren't just cold, they were freezing. Damn it. Ignoring the sharp pain in his leg, Jake forced himself to shift closer, scooping the puppies up and pulling them against his chest. They barely reacted. Their fur was icy beneath his fingertips, their tiny ribs pressing against his palms. They were just as desperate for warmth as he was. Without hesitation, he pulled his jacket open and tucked them inside against his body, zipping it up just enough to keep them snug. They needed his body heat, and he needed theirs. "Hang in there, guys," he murmured, his voice rasping in the cold air. He felt the faintest movement against his chest, one of them pressing closer, nestling against the warmth. The other let out a weak, barely audible sigh. Too weak. Too cold. Jake swallowed hard. He had to act fast. His hands fumbled for the emergency beacon strapped to his pack. A small, red device, his last hope. He clicked open the safety cover, his numb fingers barely responding. A single button. One press, and it would send out a distress signal to search and rescue. He took a deep breath and pressed it. Nothing. Jake's stomach twisted. No flashing light. No confirmation beep. He pressed it again, harder. Still nothing. No, 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 his voice was barely above a whisper, his breath coming out in uneven gasps. He shook the device, trying to knock some life into it. Then he realized, the canyon walls. The signal was too weak. A lump formed in his throat. He was trapped. The puppies were trapped. And no one knew where they were. His fingers tightened around the beacon. This couldn't be how it ended. Jake forced himself to breathe, pressing his forehead against the frozen rock behind him. He had to think. There had to be a way. But as another blast of icy wind tore through the ravine, numbing him to his core, he realized something terrifying. They weren't just fighting time anymore. They were fighting nature itself. And nature didn't care who survived. Jake's hands shook as he gripped the emergency beacon tighter, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. He had to make this work. His body was already numb from the cold, his injured leg throbbed relentlessly, and the puppies, barely stirring now, were growing weaker by the second. He clenched his jaw and tried again. Click. The beacon's button depressed beneath his thumb, but there was no reassuring flash of light, no beeping confirmation. The towering canyon walls were interfering with the signal, trapping it like a dying echo. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. He was running out of time. If he couldn't get this signal out, no one would ever find them. With a grunt, he shifted painfully, pressing his back against the cold rock behind him and propping himself up just enough to raise the beacon higher. His injured leg screamed in protest, but he ignored it, gritting his teeth through the pain. Come on, come on. He angled the device toward the sliver of sky visible through the jagged peaks above. One last shot. He held his breath and pressed the button again. For a moment, nothing. Then, a faint, blinking red light. Jake's heart leapt in his chest. The signal had gone through. But the light was weak, flickering intermittently. The transmission was barely getting out. Please, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Somebody, see this. Miles away, inside a small rescue operations station, a radio operator leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. It had been a quiet shift, too quiet. Winter in the mountains meant fewer hikers, fewer calls, and nothing but static on the distress frequency most days. Then, a blip. The operator sat up, frowning as a faint, broken signal crackled through his headset. The alert was weak, fragmented, like a whisper through a storm. He adjusted the controls, fine-tuning the receiver, his heart beginning to race. It was faint, almost too faint to pick up, but unmistakable. Someone was in trouble. Hey! We've got something, he shouted, already pulling up the coordinates. Within seconds, the rescue team was on their feet, racing to the monitors. The signal was erratic, bouncing off the canyon walls, its origin unclear. But it was there. Somewhere deep in the mountains, someone was sending a desperate call for help. And if they didn't move fast, it might be too late. Inside the mountain rescue station, alarms blared as the distress signal finally locked onto the system. The team had a rough location, but no details. No name, no condition report. Just a weak SOS beacon, barely breaking through the interference. Captain Emma Carter grabbed her gear without hesitation. 12 years in mountain rescue had prepared her for a lot, but nothing about this job was routine. Each mission was a race against time, and this one was already on the edge. She moved quickly, strapping on her heavy-duty snow jacket while scanning the monitor. The signal was too weak to pinpoint an exact location, but they had a general idea, somewhere deep in the western ravines, an area notorious for its steep drops and unstable cliffs. She turned to her team. We've got a distress call coming from the lower canyon. No voice transmission, just a weak beacon. That means either their radio's dead, their battery's shot, or, she hesitated, then finished grimly, they're too injured to respond. The room fell silent for half a second. Then, explosive movement. The team leapt into action. Every second counted in freezing temperatures. Emma grabbed her radio and called into base. We need air support on standby, but with this storm moving in, we'll have to go in on foot first. She hated the risks, but there was no choice. Helicopters were unreliable in worsening conditions, and if the signal died completely, they might never find the victim in time. They couldn't afford to wait. The doors to the station burst open, and the team poured into the cold. The wind had already picked up. The temperature had dropped several degrees in just the last half hour. Overhead, the sky was an ominous swirl of gray, the first hints of a coming blizzard creeping over the peaks. Emma's second-in-command, Logan Harris, adjusted his pack beside her. "If that storm hits full force, we'll lose visibility," he said, his voice tight. "And if this guy's stuck in a ravine, hypothermia will set in twice as fast." Emma nodded, her breath coming out in misty clouds. They were already behind. Every passing minute pushed them closer to disaster. She turned to the squad. "Double-check your gear. Thermal blankets, ropes, medical kits. We don't know what we're walking into." No one hesitated. These weren't just rescuers, they were survivors trained to handle the worst conditions the mountains could throw at them. And tonight, they were going into hell. As they moved out, Emma's jaw clenched. "Hold on, whoever you are. We're coming." The dangerous trek to the ravine, the rescue team pushed forward, fighting against nature itself. The icy wind howled through the canyons, stinging their faces and numbing their fingers despite their heavy-duty gloves. The snow beneath their boots was treacherous, shifting unpredictably over jagged rocks and hidden crevices. Emma led the way, her flashlight beam barely cutting through the thickening fog. Every step was a gamble. Loose gravel sent small rocks tumbling into the abyss beside them, a chilling reminder of the unstable terrain. "Watch your footing," Logan shouted over the wind, just as a chunk of ice broke free from a ledge above, crashing down dangerously close. Emma gritted her teeth. The storm was getting worse. To make things worse, their radios crackled with static-filled bursts of communication, the canyon walls interfering with the signal. "Base, do you copy?" Emma tried again, pressing her earpiece. Only silence. They were on their own. Then, a break. "Wait." One of the team members raised a hand. "I've got something." They scrambled toward a faint, blinking red light, Jake's emergency beacon. It was half buried in snow, pulsing weakly. Emma's stomach tightened. They were close. She scanned the ravine below, then spotted something, movement. A dark shape against the icy rock. Her heart pounded. "There. We found him." But as they got closer, she saw the truth, Jake wasn't moving. And time was running out. Jake's body was numb, his breath shallow and weak. The cold had seeped into his bones. His leg throbbed with every heartbeat, but it was distant now, lost beneath the crushing weight of exhaustion. He had been drifting in and out of consciousness, the darkness threatening to pull him under. Then, a sound. At first, he thought he was imagining it. The wind? A dream? No. Voices. Faint but real, echoing from above. His heart lurched. Rescue. Jake swallowed, his throat raw, his lips cracked from the cold. He tried to move, but his limbs felt like dead weight. The puppies, still tucked inside his jacket, stirred slightly. They were still alive. With the last bit of strength he had, he opened his mouth. His voice barely left his lips. He coughed, gasping against the dry, frozen air. He tried again. Here. It was weak, barely more than a whisper, but he forced himself to keep going. "I am, here." Above, the voices paused. Then, one of them shouted. They had heard him. For the first time since he fell, hope flickered to life. Emma secured her harness, triple-checking the knots before giving Logan a firm nod. There was no room for error. The terrain was unstable, the icy cliffs unpredictable. One wrong move, and they'd be the ones needing rescue. "Stay sharp," she warned as they began their descent. The first few feet were smooth, too smooth. The ropes held steady, their crampons digging into the rock. But as they went deeper, the canyon walls grew narrower, jagged edges scraping against their gear. Then, a sharp crack. Rock slide, someone shouted. Emma barely had time to look up before a chunk of ice and stone broke free from above, tumbling past them and shattering against the ground below. Too close. Then, another sound, a panicked yell. One of the rescuers, Kyle, lost his footing as a ledge beneath him crumbled. His body jerked violently, dangling midair as his rope snapped tight. Hold on. Logan shouted, gripping Kyle's harness and helping him regain control. A second later, and he would have gone down hard. Finally, they reached the ravine floor. Emma rushed toward Jake, kneeling beside him. He was barely conscious. His skin was ice cold, his leg badly injured. But inside his jacket, two tiny bodies trembled. The puppies were alive. Now, they had to get them all out, fast. Emma leaned over Jake, carefully brushing snow off his face. His eyelids fluttered, and he let out a weak, shuddering breath. He was barely holding on. But when she reached for the puppies inside his jacket, a sudden, sharp yelp filled the air. The tiny creatures, weak but terrified, squirmed deeper into Jake's arms. Their small bodies trembled, their fur damp from his warmth. One of them let out a frightened whimper, burying its face against his chest. They don't want to leave him, Logan muttered, crouching beside her. Emma exhaled. Of course they didn't. To them, Jake wasn't just a person, he was their protector, their only source of warmth and safety. Carefully, she reached out again, speaking softly. Hey, little guys. It's okay. We're here to help. One of the puppies growled, a tiny, feeble sound, but full of determination. The other whined, refusing to budge. Emma exchanged a glance with Logan. They had to be gentle. Rushing this would only make things worse. Slowly, she unzipped Jake's jacket, letting the warmth of her gloved hands replace the cold air. It's all right, she whispered, rubbing one of their tiny heads. The puppy hesitated, then, after a moment, pressed against her hand. Finally, they started to trust. And the real rescue began. The heart-stopping ascent with Jake strapped into the rescue harness, Emma gave the signal. Winch him up, slow and steady. The system whirred to life, the rope tightening as Jake's unconscious body lifted off the ground. His injured leg dangled, his face pale from exhaustion and cold. The puppies, now wrapped in insulated pouches, had already been secured to another rescuer. All that was left was getting everyone out alive. But then, disaster. A loud snap echoed through the canyon. The winch system jerked violently, then stopped. He's stuck. Logan shouted. Emma's heart pounded. Jake was dangling midair, nearly 20 feet above the ravine floor, completely exposed. The rope creaked under the strain. If it failed, he would plummet back down. No time to fix it, Logan said, already unclipping his safety rope. I'm going up there. Logan, wait, but he was already moving, climbing hand over hand up the sheer rock face. His muscles strained as he reached Jake, bracing himself against the cliffside. With one arm, he held onto the rope, with the other, he clutched Jake's harness, taking on the weight himself. Get that winch working, he shouted. Emma's fingers flew over the emergency release, praying they weren't too late. The winch groaned back to life, slowly pulling Jake upward. Logan held on with everything he had, his arms burning from the strain. The entire team watched, hearts pounding, breath frozen in their chests, almost there. Emma called, positioning herself at the edge. With a final, agonizing pull, they hauled Jake over the ledge. Logan followed seconds later, collapsing onto the ice, his chest heaving. They had done it. But the moment Jake's body hit solid ground, he tried to move. The puppies, his voice was barely a whisper, his face pale from exhaustion and pain. Emma knelt beside him, pressing a firm but gentle hand to his chest. They're safe, Jake. We got them. He didn't believe her at first. His glassy eyes darted around, searching, until one of the rescuers approached with the tiny, shivering pups wrapped in thermal blankets. Jake exhaled, his body finally giving in. His head fell back, completely spent. "We need to get him on a stretcher, now," Emma ordered. But as they lifted him, a faint smile crossed his lips. He had saved them. And they had saved him. The aftermath, a story of survival. Jake's eyes fluttered open, the soft beeping of medical monitors filling the quiet hospital room. For a moment, he was disoriented, then it all came rushing back. The ravine. The fall. The cold. The puppies. Before he could process anything else, the door swung open. "You're awake," Emma said, relief evident in her voice. She and Logan stepped inside, both looking exhausted but relieved. Jake tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his leg. "The puppies." Logan grinned. "Alive and well." He pulled out his phone, showing a picture, the two tiny pups wrapped in blankets, their eyes brighter, their frail bodies recovering at a local animal shelter. Jake exhaled, the tension in his chest finally easing. "You're lucky to be alive, you know," Emma said, crossing her arms. "Not many people survive a fall like that." Jake chuckled weakly. "Guess I had a good rescue team." News of his story had already spread. "Hiker risks life to save abandoned puppies," flashed across TV screens and headlines. Messages of admiration poured in. But for Jake, the real victory wasn't fame. It was knowing those puppies had a future, and maybe, just maybe, he'd be the one to give it to them. A bittersweet ending, new beginnings. A week later, Jake stood outside the animal shelter, his leg still in a brace but his heart lighter than it had been in days. The door swung open, and a worker stepped out, cradling two tiny, now much healthier puppies in her arms. "They've been waiting for you," she said with a smile, gently handing them over. Jake felt their small bodies nestle against him, warm and trusting. They remembered him. They had fought to survive just as hard as he had. And now, they were finally going home, together. At the rescue station, Emma, Logan, and the rest of the team gathered around a table, a quiet celebration in progress. Another life saved. Another battle won. But they all knew their job was never done. There would always be another distress call, another life hanging in the balance, another storm threatening to erase a chance at survival. And they would always answer. Outside the hospital, Jake took his first steps toward a new life. The puppies trotted beside him, their tails wagging. He glanced up at the sky, breathing in the crisp mountain air. He had been given a second chance. And he wasn't going to waste it.